Joe Biden, who is in trouble with the Ukraine assistance package, can now link that to Israel, saying it's two for the price of one. It's a double bill. And you House Republicans, you want aid to Israel, but if you want that aid to Israel quickly, then you've got to accept that it's going to be also be tied to a package for Ukraine as well.
Dr. Shea, could you just provide our viewers with a little bit of background on the fighting that we've seen over the weekend? Was there any kind of warning signs that Israel might have missed?
Well, certainly, in retrospect, the Israelis are going to learn a lot about the mistakes they made. And when you get these kind of major catastrophes, you remember 9/11 back in 2001, everybody is taken by surprise at the time. But then, of course, when the intelligence review kicks in, blue ribbon government panels are set up, to investigate. It rapidly becomes clear that all of the signs were there. It's simply for various reasons they were missed. This failure of Israeli intelligence has surprised a lot of people because Gaza is a tiny place. The Israelis have got lots of informants there. We now are hearing stories that with the complicity of Iran, although that has to be proven, these attacks were planned 1 year before they took place. So plenty of time to pick them up. Given the number of rockets used, the number of weapons used, the fact that so many Hamas fighters were used, it seems highly surprising that Israel didn't pick up something somewhere. Maybe they simply didn't take it seriously. Maybe they thought that at the end of the day, Hamas, which has lately sort of kept a fairly quiet situation in the Gaza Strip. The big problems have been on the other side in the West Bank, as you know, with the Palestinians. Maybe the Israelis simply didn't think that Hamas would really sort of want to sort of shake the uneasy truce by doing this. So we're still of course going to have to get to the bottom of that. But my sense, in the future, is the result will not be that there was no way we could have known that this was going on, but rather that yes, as with 9/11, the signs were there, but for various reasons we didn't pick them up. We didn't dot the I's and we didn't cross the T's.
You said that Hamas has been planning this for a year now. What do you think prompted them to strike at this exact time?
That's an excellent question, and I suppose that obviously the only sort of answer is to say we would have to ask them. So somebody like me can only speculate. But what I would say is first of all, probably being given a lot of at least again we have to prove this, but the signs are a lot of Iranian weapons, Iranian money, the ability to produce weapons in large quantity, which means that they could fire 7,000 within a matter of hours into Israel, thereby really achieving a strategic impact. Up until then, they had only limited numbers of rockets, limited amounts of weapons, limited amounts of money, so they really couldn't do anything on this scale which would have such an impact. So getting the capability to do something serious, I think, is the first part of the answer to your question. Secondly, there's no doubt about it, the frustration is building up, has been for a while, particularly since a new very right-wing Israeli government came into power, particularly with the expansion of the settlements on the West Bank, the trouble on the West Bank between Palestinians and Israeli settlers. Over 200 Palestinians have been killed on the West Bank in that violence thus far this year, and some Israeli settlers, of course, as well. So this sort of growing sense of frustration and stalemate that nothing was really moving, nothing was really changing. Gaza was remaining a place where 2.3 million Palestinians with no future, no jobs were being bottled up year in, year out. And so I suppose, even if they know or knew that ultimately, the Israelis would hit them hard and would decimate their ranks and, send them back to the beginning, Hamas may have thought that it was worth it. It was worth it, to stage such a spectacular operation, which, when the dust settles, will get the international community, whether Israel likes it or not, to sort of say, well, we've neglected this Middle East peace process, we've neglected this Palestinian issue, we thought the Israelis had it under control. We've seen that if we don't deal with it, there are going to be these upsurges of violence getting worse, with more Iranian involvement. So, we've got to, go back to some sort of political movement here. And Hamas may feel that if that's the result at the end of the day, more political attention by the international community, what it did was worthwhile. But we'll have to wait and see if that's what happens in the longer run.
How much of this do you think is Iran? Because for a very long time, Iran has been funding, training, and arming Hamas. And then, this this attack kind of happened during this planned normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia, which is a key kind of, strategic point for Iran.
Well, certainly what Iran seems to have been doing over the last few years is sort of constructing a sort of military circle around Israel, particularly by, as you said, arming Hamas. By obviously continuing to arm Hezbollah, a much more significant and dangerous force for the Israelis in Lebanon, which is reputed to have up to 40,000 Iranian rockets in its arsenal. And if it got involved in this fighting and the Israelis were fighting on two fronts, this would be a very serious situation for them. But also, of course, reinforcing the Assad regime in Syria, Israel's sworn enemy. Assad has survived. He's now back. On the diplomatic circuit, particularly in the Gulf area. And of course, the Iranians, with help from the Russians, have been building his army and some of the pro-Assad militia forces, which also could attack Israel. So this is not comfortable for the Israelis in the sense that you now have all of these various militia groups funded and armed by Iran coming at you from all directions. And as I've said, if they all tried something at the same time, splitting the Israeli defense forces 3 or 4 ways, that could be quite a serious situation. Iran, of course, at the same time has also been assisting Russia in Ukraine with drones and military technology. So it's a willingness to take these kind of big strategic risks, and also the fact that its nuclear weapons program, unfortunately, is no longer being reined in by an arms control agreement. This is not only worrying for Israel, but it's also worrying for the West. And that's why I think the United States, back on Sunday, the day after the Hamas incursion, immediately sent an aircraft carrier, the biggest the United States has, the Gerald Ford, with a number of destroyers and cruisers and frigates to the Eastern Mediterranean to put on a big show of force to warn Iran, to back off and not try to exploit the conflict further. The Iranians, Ayatollah Khamenei, today have denied being involved, but I think that most diplomats and intelligence officials would take that with a large dose of salt. They may not have sort of told Hamas to attack on Saturday. We'll have to wait and see. But as you rightly said, without them providing the millions of dollars, the technology, the training, the intelligence, it would be very difficult for Hezbollah or Hamas to launch these kind of operations.
And you mentioned Russia there. Is there any sense that Russia could be involved as well as Iran?
I don't believe so. I think the Russians always like to sort of take their propaganda victory from these kind of incidents. They're very quick and they're very agile, and of course immediately they'll say, well, if the West had been paying more attention to this instead of getting involved in this sort of useless conflict in Ukraine where we're bound to win, and then it wouldn't have happened. But on the other hand, the Russians have had good relations with Israel. As well as traditionally good relations with Israel's enemies. I mean, there are over 1 million Israelis of Russian descent living in Israel, including many oligarchs and millionaires. Israel did not impose sanctions on Russia after Russia invaded Ukraine, and Ukraine has been very frustrated that Israel, which has first-class anti-missile systems like Iron Dome or Arrow or David Sling, has chosen not to supply them to Ukraine when Ukraine would dearly love to have this sophisticated Israeli technology to defend itself against Russian missile attacks. So Russia, I think, is unlike Iran, is in a more delicate situation. It's had good relations with Israel. It doesn't want to throw them away by too overtly taking the side of the Palestinians, but it's got its own clients to look after. It has signed these defense agreements with Iran as well recently, particularly for the provision of the Shea drones. So it will be, if you like, trying to ride two horses in the circus at the same time, but also taking delight in the fact that a major ally of the West, such as Israel, has now been sort of shown to be vulnerable in this way.
Even if Russia isn't directly involved, how does this benefit Russia?
Well, diversion, I think, is the main thing. I mean, let's take a practical example. The US Congress is now debating a major arms package for Israel. And unlike Ukraine, where Ukraine fatigue, as we know, has set in with the US Congress, as you know, we saw just a couple of days ago in the budget agreement that to get that budget agreement, the administration had to sort of sacrifice $6 billion of aid to Ukraine, which it badly wanted to have. And so clearly, clearly, now, if we have a situation where the US Congress immediately prioritizes aid to Israel, which of course is deeply entrenched in US domestic politics, rather than aid to Ukraine, and all of those American 155 millimeter ammunition shells that Ukraine wants for its counteroffensive, or these air defense systems, which I was referring to earlier, if those start going to Israel rather than to Ukraine, and the funding goes more towards Israel, then Ukraine, of course, which wants to continue its offensive for some weeks yet, could be in a difficult situation. But on the other hand, Morgan, it could work the other way, which is to say that you could have a situation where Joe Biden, who is in trouble with the Ukraine assistance package, can now link that to Israel, saying it's two for the price of one. It's a double bill. And you House Republicans, you want aid to Israel, but if you want that aid to Israel quickly, then you've got to accept that it's going to be also be tied to a package for Ukraine as well. So it could also maybe rescue the administration. The Pentagon says that it can do both. It can provide both Ukraine and Israel, at least for the time being. We'll have to wait and see how true that plays out. But certainly, obviously, the opening of a big second front, a crisis that could continue for a while, where the US, of course, has big stakes in terms of its relationship with Israel, and the need to have Israel's back, the need to look at maybe confront Iran, also Russia in the Middle East. This is going to be a big diversion from focusing on Ukraine. President Lyndon Johnson said a good politician has to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. But we know that in reality, that's not so easy. And so I think if you're in Kiev, if you're President Zelensky at the moment, you're going to be a little bit worried that the opening of a second front is going to divert help and attention from your cause at a particularly difficult time in the Ukrainian counteroffensive.
You're talking about a second front, but it's in some ways a third front because we have Ukraine and Russia, we have now Israel and Palestine and Hamas. But then we also have China and Taiwan, which is a really long term conflict, and that militarization on the South China Sea, which I guess is kind of with different weapons because it's in the ocean. But, China and Taiwan's a really long term kind of goal for the US and Western nations. Israel, those links with the United States and those Western nations are really, they've had those relationships for a long time. So to me, it feels like if we're kind of on three fronts, the the one that might lose the balance a bit would be Ukraine.
Well, you're right. So the United States, of course, is working very hard to improve its relations with China. A major congressional delegation led by Chuck Schumer in the Senate has been in Beijing, and they saw President Xi yesterday, and also called very firmly on President Xi, by the way, to condemn Hamas. He didn't do it at the beginning of the meeting, but the Chinese were making some more positive noises later on, and so the United States clearly, I think, will be mindful not to antagonize unduly China at the moment when it's antagonizing Russia and maybe getting involved into a stickier situation with Iran. That doesn't mean to say that the presidency wouldn't sort of do something vis-a-vis Taiwan. And of course, the aim of reunification, reconciliation is firmly entrenched in the platform of the Chinese Communist Party. But on the other hand, the United States, for some months already, has been rearming Taiwan with aircraft and missiles. I mean, the lesson of the Ukraine war has been don't wait for the war to begin before you send the supplies, do it in advance. So Taiwan has been significantly modernizing its military arsenal. On the other hand, for China, it's a bit more difficult to invade Taiwan than it is for Russia to invade Ukraine because, of course, the Chinese have to cross hundreds of miles of sea in an amphibious operation, always much more difficult than when you simply have to walk over the border and you're in the country that you're invading. And I think, President Xi, still sort of seeing the difficulties that Russia has had in Ukraine, would sort of be mindful to make sure that he has 100% guarantee of success before he launches the operation. And I doubt if he thinks that he's there yet. So I take your point fully, but I don't think that what we're seeing at the moment is going to induce President Xi to wake up tomorrow morning and, as he's shaving, think today's the day. My sort of opponents are all diverted elsewhere. I don't, Taiwan is going to be on the table for some time. The other thing, by the way, is the Taiwanese are perfectly happy to pay for their weapons that they have from the United States, which means it's somewhat easier for the Americans to supply them because, unlike Ukraine, which gets them sort of, if you like, on tick or on credit or free, the Taiwanese weapons are paid for in full.
I mean, Netanyahu has said that he's ready if this is going to be a really long war. What's your kind of prediction as to how long this conflict could last?
Well, it all depends, of course, if the conflict escalates, widens out, and that's, of course, the big. I think for the time being, the immediate fear of the international community that Hezbollah would sort of jump in. They shot a few missiles across the border on Saturday, and I understand a few more this morning. But given their arsenal, nothing significant, and there's been a kind of live and let live policy between Israel and Hezbollah in recent years because the last time they had a serious clash was in 2006, when Israel invaded southern Lebanon to drive out Hezbollah. Now, this didn't go particularly well for the Israelis, but on the other hand, it was a disaster for Lebanon. The economy tanked, and Hezbollah got a lot of the blame from the Lebanese afterwards and lost a great deal of its popularity because the Lebanese said, look, you shouldn't have started this confrontation. Look at, what's happening now with the Israeli blockade. And I think if you look at the economic situation in Lebanon today, you remember the big explosion in the port of Beirut a couple of years back, the government instability. I think Hezbollah would be mindful of not doing something which completely tanks Lebanon altogether as a country. But we don't know, and that is a situation that has to be handled carefully. I mentioned the deterrence of Iran. I think particularly if Iranian complicity can be proved, you can see that the United States would go to the United Nations and call for even more swinging sanctions to be imposed on Iran. So Iran again might be happy to score a propaganda victory, but would it want at this stage also to risk a confrontation? Particularly having just gone through some pretty powerful anti-government demonstrations, as you know, over the last year, which has rocked the regime. Syria, I mentioned Assad is consolidating, but he's still sort of consolidating power in the country after the Arab Spring Rebellion. So, key question for the international community: contain the conflict. Now, Hezbollah, I think, will be temporarily crushed by the Israelis, which does not mean that it won't re-emerge again. And then that really poses, I think, Morgan, the question of will there be a third intifada? If the West Bank, 8 Palestinians have been killed so far, far fewer than the appalling figures, we've seen in Gaza of 700, and the number will go up. And again, of course, the 900 Israelis, appalling loss of life there. But if you now get a generalized uprising in the West Bank, you remember we used to call them intifadas when the Palestinian youth used to would throw stones, attacks on Israeli settlements, that kind of thing, then that could also be difficult for Israel. So I think one of the things that Israel will try to do in forming a government of national unity, bringing in the opposition, including former military figures into the government, and maybe isolating some of the more hot-headed right-wing figures who have been in the government recently, is basically just clamp down on the settlers to make sure that they don't stir up things, which in turn could stir up the Palestinians on the West Bank as well. I think the real problem for Israel will be it wants to crush Hamas, but it's mindful that as the days go by, inevitably, public opinion, yourselves in the media, all of us will focus more on the Israeli response and maybe less on the initial Hamas outrage. Obviously, the humanitarian situation in Gaza. The UN has reported today that 180,000 Palestinians have been made homeless in Gaza already. The shortage of food, the absence of medical supplies, the hospitals that can't function, the lack of fuel for electricity, and all of those things. There will be a dire humanitarian situation. So I think the challenge for Israel is to sort of, if you like, crush Hamas, justifiably retaliating for an egregious attack, but without losing the sympathy of the international community by being seen to be ultimately taking it out on the civilians in Gaza. And that may act as a kind of restraining factor on the Israelis as they go forward in the days ahead.
I just wanted to ask more widely, what do you think this means for not only stability in Palestine and Israel, but more broadly in the Middle East?
Well, I think what the international community want to do first of all is not go into reverse. When you have a big international crisis like this, as you well know, uh, future options can be cut off. Uh, uh, but you don't want to go backwards as a result. Look at the Abraham Accords, one of the great sort of triumphs of American diplomacy, even where Donald Trump could take some credit for a rare foreign policy success, if I can put it that way, was in these Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and Arab states, Gulf states, remember United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and so on, which had been resolutely opposed to Israel for many years. And you rightly mentioned yourself at the beginning of our talk that the Israelis were hoping that they could get the very big achievement of an Abraham Accord now with Saudi Arabia to normalize relations. That may be postponed, but I think given this enormous effort to make Israel more sort of acceptable in the Arab world, following the rather cold peace agreements with Jordan and Egypt that were signed several decades ago after the last wars. I think the United States, the international community, will be anxious that the Gulf states showing solidarity with the Palestinians that don't now break these agreements with Israel, thereby returning Israel to complete isolation in the region. So don't move backwards. I think, secondly, the issue of Iranian influence and power is going to be a big one. But I think the most important thing of all, when the dust settles, is Israel's the image of Israeli invincibility has been broken. Deterrence has not succeeded. The might of Israel has not, been able to prevent the worst disaster in terms of loss of life that I think Israel has ever suffered. I don't think even in the Six-Day War or the Yom Kippur War, or you have to go back, I think, all the way to the conflicts of 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel to see such a loss of life among Israeli citizens from a conflict. People have spoken of Israel's 9/11 moment, as you well know. If you look at the Israeli population proportionate to the number of people who have been killed. So for the Israelis, it's a turning point. This is a bitterly divided country which has been tearing itself apart between liberals and right-wing nationalists over the reform of the judiciary. The army has been divided over all of this, but the conflict will restore national unity for a while. A national unity government, we're all Israelis now, if I can use that phrase that we used for Americans after the 9/11 attacks. But Israel's got to look very carefully at its future. Is the answer to go back to this sort of illusion of total security? Fences, big armies, watchtowers, barbed wire, closing off the problem. No, I would argue that, that's shown to have failed. Or is the answer now to sort of, go back to this difficult but unavoidable question of the creation of a Palestinian state, the two-state solution, going back to negotiations? The Biden administration has neglected this, thinking, well, these talks weren't going anywhere. I'm not going to waste any political capital in them. But a problem that's neglected doesn't go away. It festers, it contaminates, it blows up in your face. So, when the dust settles, we have to think that, what's best for Israel, what's best for the security of Israel, and the total state solution, I think, is going to be exposed by this. Only a political solution at the end of the day is going to sort of prevent attacks on this scale from happening again in the future.